enough if it seriously misrepresented his moral nature by repeatedly portraying him as authorizing conduct he did not authorize. But now if 3 and 4 are true, that is, if the Bible repeatedly represents God as authorizing conduct which is clearly morally wrong, and if it doesn't seriously misrepresent God's moral nature by repeatedly portraying him as authorizing conduct he did not authorize, then I think it follows that God did repeatedly authorize conduct which was clearly morally wrong. But that, I thought, would be incompatible with God's perfection. That is, I thought it followed from my first assumption about God's moral perfection that God would never authorize conduct which was clearly morally wrong. And since there's a contradiction between 5 and 6, there must be some mistake in this reasoning, either in the initial assumptions, propositions 1 through 3, or in one of the inferences made from those assumptions. I thought and continue to think that the weakest link in the argument is the assumption that the Bible is the inspired Word of God. I've had some difficulty deciding what Peter thinks is wrong with this argument, since he's willing to grant proposition 3, that is to say that God is frequently represented as having commanded things that are clearly wrong. He must either reject the inference to proposition 4 or the inference to proposition 6. And for a while I wasn't sure which way he'd go, but on reflection I've concluded that he must accept 4. The Bible does not seriously misrepresent, etc. And reject the inference of 6 from 1. That is, say, reject the conclusion that God, even though God's morally perfect, he'd never authorize conduct which is clearly morally wrong. This seems to me a pretty paradoxical conclusion, and I hesitate to ascribe it to Peter without an explicit statement on his part, but I think this assumption may underlie the little just so story he tells us about how we got, or might have gotten, the set of moral convictions we have. Part of the purpose of the Hebrew Bible, Peter says, is to give us training in a new morality, and that fact is somehow supposed to help us in reconciling the prima facie contradiction which he grants between the divine inspiration of the Bible and the fact that it frequently represents God as commanding things which are indisputably wrong. He emphasizes that simply proclaiming a new morality, just telling people to do what the new morality requires, is not an effective way of getting people to embrace it. Surely he's right about that. I've had children and grandchildren and students. I know a thing or two about the limits of moral exhortation. But it looks as though the method Peter thinks God used was to first tell people to do the wrong thing, telling them to do what is objectively wrong, that is, not presenting it to them as the wrong thing to do, and then to reach into us and touch our hearts and guide our thoughts until we saw that it was the wrong thing to do. And apparently the reason God acted in this way was that his human creatures are so strongly inclined by their natures to do the wrong thing, so naturally prone to genocide, child sacrifice, slavery, and rape, that if he told them to do the right thing, they wouldn't listen to him. If you think this has a strong odor of Manichaeism about it, if you think it represents human nature as an awful given that God has no responsibility for and has to adjust to as best he can, I would agree. Of course, when Peter tells his story, he never says explicitly that God acted this way. He never says in so many words that God repeatedly authorized conduct which is clearly morally wrong, and that this was an integral part of his method of moral training. And quite apart from any concerns about heresy, I can see why he might hesitate to make that explicit. Skeptical theists tend to set the bar pretty low when they're telling a story about how God might have had morally sufficient reason for doing what he did. But if the story were spelled out in the way it seems it must be, it might seem incredible even to a skeptical theist, and not one which is true for all we know. After all, it doesn't seem that the commands to commit genocide and child sacrifice and the permissions to practice slavery and engage in rape are doing any work in this story. Now, I have some reservations about that, which I'll come to at the end. That's what I thought when I wrote these comments. I think something a little different now. What's doing the work is the fact that God is said to reach into us and touch our hearts and guide our thoughts until we see that genocide and child sacrifice and slavery and rape are wrong. The commands and permissions seem to be quite superfluous in this story. In fact, they seem, if anything, to be an obstacle. I mean, God has to reach into our hearts to correct things that he's already told us we ought to do. Moreover, acting in this way would seem quite out of character for the biblical God. If the biblical record is even approximately accurate, the human propensity to commit murder, theft, and adultery did not deter God from issuing commandments against those offenses. And of course, he did not have to rely on mere exhortation. Of course, mere exhortation isn't worth much. But when it's accompanied with the impressive array of rewards and punishments that God had in his arsenal, it can be pretty effective, I guess. I don't think Peter's attempts at actual history are much more successful than his venture into hypothetical history. He claims that the morality to which critics of the moral character of the God of the Bible appeal is a gift to the world from Israel and the church, as if we learned nothing about morality from the ancient Greeks and Romans, or at any rate, nothing good. And as if many of the better parts of Judeo-Christian morality had not been developed independently in other traditions. He may believe those things. He may believe that those of us who criticize biblical morality got all our moral insights, or all our best moral insights from the biblical tradition. I can't. Still, Peter has made the best reply to my line of argument that I've seen. Okay, now I do want to amend these written comments in just one way. I think I began to see a role that that God's having issued these commandments might have played in Peter's story. I didn't appreciate it until I heard him read his paper when he was talking about the missionaries and how they use the Bible as an effective tool for converting people to Christianity.
Professor Curley, maybe. Professor Curley.
Oh, yeah.
I wonder if it wouldn't be best to have that during the Q&A. Would that be?
Let me finish the sentence. Okay.
Certainly.
Where the hell was I? On my way to hell, I guess. Okay. Yeah. He can't imagine a native approached by a missionary reacting to the story about in Deuteronomy about how you're supposed to utterly destroy neighboring peoples with horror. And so it looks as though he thinks that the morality presented in the Bible is an effective tool for converting pagans who are subject to the natural immorality of human beings. I doubt very much, actually, that the missionaries make much of the Code of Deuteronomy when they're trying to convert natives to Christianity. I suspect they emphasize the nicer parts of the Bible. So I still don't think it really plays much of a role in his story about moral training. Okay, thank you.
When I'd like to explain myself better, let me mention just one, because I can mention. Okay, let me mention just one. Wait a minute, I wrote it down here so I can, because I can do this one very briefly. Ed says that I said this, that part of the purpose of the Hebrew Bible is to give us training in a new morality. Now, when I talk about training in a new morality, that was supposed to be something God did with the ancient Hebrew people, and I said that the Hebrew Bible is a record of this. I didn't claim that the Hebrew Bible
is part of the training?
No, well, for a lot of
actually, it would be helpful if you guys actually would sit at the table so we can use the microphones.
Okay,
and then it'll get recorded.
Okay. But then I can't turn around and look him in the eye.
Ed can come down to the table too.
And speak at the same time.
be on the same level here. Excellent. Yes, please.